At the beginning of 1939, Europe was in a tense state. With the threat of war, political intrigue, and geopolitical wrangling against this backdrop, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, came into force, formally known as the Non-Aggression Pact. This treaty overshadowed in its disguise the darker plans contained in a secret protocol that divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence for both countries. The treaty, signed on August 23, 1939, envisioned non-aggression by both sides against each other for 10 years. This outwardly appeared to be a diplomatic move to prevent conflict. But the secret protocol attached to the document established frightening and nefarious plans for spheres of influence and future territorial acquisitions. The Soviet Union, anxious to secure itself against possible German aggression, actively participated in the preparation of this treaty by skillfully crafting his policy. Stalin tried to capitalize on the complex international situation, while Hitler saw the treaty as a temporary truce that would allow him to consolidate his position in the West before the upcoming conflict. The secret protocol defined both countries' spheres of influence. In Eastern Europe, Poland, the country that would eventually become the scene of the outbreak of World War II, was divided between Germany and the Soviet Union. This dark plan foreshadowed the storm that hit Poland in September 1939. Thus, on September 1, 1939, German forces launched their attack on Poland, beginning the invasion that was the beginning of years of terrible warfare. Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, was a strategy involving combined attacks by air, ground, and armored forces to penetrate the enemy's rear as quickly as possible. Hitler's method was impressively effective, and within weeks German forces had swept across most of Poland. Picturesque maps of military operations described the dynamic lines of advance of the German army penetrating deep into enemy territory. During the same period, under a treaty secretly concluded with Hitler, the Soviet Union invaded the eastern regions of Poland. This moment was a clear manifestation of the grim plans. Frozen on the paper of a secret protocol, the Soviet army clashed with Polish forces and entered regions that were destined for Stalin's sphere of influence. However, this invasion was not limited to Poland alone. The Soviet Union's intransigent actions also affected Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which were forcibly annexed into the Soviet sphere of influence. Through his actions, Stalin once again confirmed his ambition and ruthless conduct of foreign policy while crippling the geopolitical map of Eastern Europe. With the successful completion of the campaign in the West in 1940, Hitler stopped hiding his aggressive intentions and revised his strategic plans. The occupation of the Baltic states, such as Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, was another step in strengthening the Soviet Union's position in the region. It was a dark foreshadowing of future events and long-term consequences for Eastern Europe. While in the East, Germany and the Soviet Union were actively pursuing their plans. In the West, Germany launched a blitzkrieg against France and the Benelux countries. The Manch Plan was carried out with impressive speed and scale, as the German army effectively utilized new tactics and military equipment. Germany passed through the Ardennes, behind the bypass of the Maginot Line, and recalled back to move deep into France, surprising the world with its speed and aggressiveness. Having completed the campaign in the West, Hitler, having signed a peace treaty with France in 1940, decided to change the strategic direction of his military operations. The attention of the Nazi leadership shifted to the East, where the Soviet Union, led by Stalin, remained the last major opponent that had not succumbed to German influence. In 1941, preparations began for Operation Barbarossa, the code name for an offensive against the Soviet Union. This operation envisioned a large-scale invasion of the East by German forces to occupy and subjugate Soviet territories. Troop mobilization, intellectual and logistical preparations were the most important steps in this direction. Germany mobilized huge military forces, including tank divisions, infantry units, and air flotillas for a direct invasion of the Eastern Front. Intensive training and exercises began to take place. To ensure that the troops were highly capable of fighting, also important was work on logistics, taking into account the vast distances to be covered during the offensive. As a result of all these measures, in June 1941, Operation Barbarossa was launched. German troops attacked the Soviet Union, beginning a new and, it later became clear, one of the bloodiest chapters of World War II. June 22, 1941 was a day that changed the course of World War II forever. Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in the history of military conflict, had begun. And the event had a huge impact on the course of events. Germany deployed 3 groups of armies, moving from different directions to encompass the Soviet Union in a huge ring. This strategic division of forces was designed to meet in the center of the Soviet Union and encircle the main forces of the Red Army. German generals devised cunning plans, directing their troops in key directions to achieve maximum impact. Army Group North, under Field Marshal Bock, marched toward Leningrad, planning the siege of that important city. Army Group Center, under Field Marshal von Box, headed into the heart of the Soviet Union, targeting Moscow. Army Group South, under Field Marshal von Rundstedt, moved south, aiming for Ukraine and Crimea. German forces encountered massive resistance from the Red Army. For the first time, especially in the initial phase of the offensive, the Soviets, who were unprepared for such a massive invasion, faced the strength and swiftness of the German army, set in motion by brilliant tactical maneuvers. Operation Barbarossa brought Germany early successes, but it also exposed its long-term shortcomings. The Soviet Union's resistance was not broken, and a long and bloody war on the Eastern Front ensued that inflicted terrible casualties on both sides. The initial successes of the German forces under Operation Barbarossa were the greatest and most stunning. In the first phase of the war, the Soviet forces were unable to resist the blitzkrieg and succumbed in the face of the onslaught of German forces. This led to the rapid capture of vast territories, including Belarus, Ukraine, and parts of Russia. Germany easily achieved one success after another. Cities and regions fell under its sway, and the eyes of the world were fixed on the rapid advance of Nazi troops. Major cities such as Minsk, Kiev, and Odessa fell under German control, creating the illusion of the undeniable power of the Nazi machine. German forces faced stubborn and heroic resistance from Soviet troops and population. Germany's territorial acquisitions faced resistance in cities that became symbols of strength and national unity. Leningrad was the site of one of the longest sieges in history, where the city's population resisted starvation and bombardment. Moscow became the center of national resistance, fighting snowstorms and snowless winters to repel German attacks. Stalingrad became the site of bloody battles where Soviet soldiers and citizens fought for every house, every street, in a desperate attempt to stop the Nazi army's advance. These cities became symbols of heroism and bravery, and their stories became an important part of the national myth of the Great Patriotic War. The resistance in these cities also became a key factor in turning the tide of the war in favor of the Soviet Union, emphasizing not only strategic importance but also moral superiority. Soviet counteroffensives during the winter months of 1940–1942 proved decisive in changing the course of World War II. The most significant was the Battle of Moscow, which was the key point where the Soviet forces were able to repel the German army offensive. The winter of 1941 proved to be a severe test for both sides. The German army, unprepared for Russia's harsh winter conditions, found it difficult to maintain the front line and fight in snowy landscapes. The Soviet command, on the other hand, was able to adapt to the local conditions, which made it possible to conduct successful counteroffensives. Soviet forces launched effective counteroffensives in various sectors of the front, from Leningrad to Rostov-on-Don. However, the most important event was the Battle of Moscow. Here, Soviet troops under the command of Georgy Zhukov and other outstanding military leaders were able to halt the German army's advance, difficult conditions, and severe cold, so unpleasant for the German troops, became allies of the Soviet resistance. This battle marked a turning point in the course of the war. On the Eastern Front, Soviet troops launched active counteroffensives and then went on the offensive, liberating territories that had been lost in the initial period of the war. The winter battles not only slowed the German offensive, but also created a base for future Soviet successes. In the long run, these events played a crucial role in the defeat of the German army and the Allied victory in World War II. The offensive that began after this period was a precursor to the final attack on Berlin in 1945, which led to the end of the war in Europe.